All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. As Nadia mentioned, my name is Lindsay Yoder. I'm the Aquatic Invasive Species Program Coordinator for the Lower Hudson Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. And as such, I do a lot of educational programming surrounding aquatic invasive species in the region. And because I don't know everyone's background and knowledge of invasive species, I like to give just a general overview about invasives, until we get into identification. So how this presentation is going to go. We're just going to walk through overview of invasive species, talk about what makes aquatic invasive species a little bit different, some mechanisms for invasion and vectors of spread and pathways. And then we'll get into some identification and talk about ways that you can help to protect New York waters. So first and foremost, when we talk about invasive species, we have to make some important distinctions in terminology. There's a lot of different terms that get thrown around when you start, talking about invasives. So first and foremost, we've got native species. And native species, probably pretty obviously, are species that naturally evolved in a given region, or maybe they evolved elsewhere, but they arrived here through their own dispersal mechanisms. And we consider native species to the Hudson Valley as anything prior to colonization. These are species that were historically very important to the indigenous people of the Hudson Valley, things like the American eel, striped bass, eastern oyster, and Vallisneria americana, or water celery, which is this plant on the bottom here. Alternatively, we also have introduced species. These are species that are not native to a region and arrived specifically through human assistance, either intentionally or, by accident. And this, of course, when you compare this to native, this would be things that came after colonization. And we have a lot of introduced species that aren't necessarily invasive, which is why the terms aren't necessarily synonymous. Things like bluegill, largemouth bass, rainbow trout, these are all introduced species in our region because they're not actually native to the Hudson Valley, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're invasive. So, within introduced, there are a lot of terms: alien, non-native, exotic, non-indigenous, foreign, naturalized, and of course, invasive. So let's break down or introduce the definition of invasive species specifically. Now, in the PRISM, and because I am an invasive species manager, we go by the federal definition, and that is: an invasive species is an alien species whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. And in this case, alien, of course, it's an introduced species, refers to any species that is not native to a particular ecosystem. So you see, the important part of the definition of invasive species is that impact component. So it's likely to cause an impact to the economy, to our environment, or to human health. And that's why not every non-native species is necessarily considered invasive. Let's break down that definition a little bit more. Non-native, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not native to the United States. It could just mean that it's not native to a region. A really good example of this is the rusty crayfish here. It's actually native to the Ohio River Basin, but it's invasive to the Hudson Valley. Variable leaf milfoil is a plant that is native to much of the United States, the eastern United States, even as close as southern New Jersey, but it's actually invasive in parts of our region. The second part of that definition, impact: environmental, economic, or human harm. It doesn't have to cause all three of those impacts to be considered invasive, but some do, like the zebra mussel. And we'll talk a little bit more about the zebra mussel a little bit later. And something else to consider when thinking about invasive species is that any negative impacts outweigh potential benefits. There are a lot of invasive species that do have some potential benefits, but a lot of times anything that, any impact it might have to the economy or the environment, it would usually outweigh those benefits. A really good example is Phragmites, which I'm sure a lot of you have seen or are familiar with. Phragmites is a pretty decent buffer plant, and it acts as a bank stabilizer, and it keeps pollution from eroding into waterways, but it takes the space up for our native plants that do the same thing, things like cattail and other marsh plants that provide habitat for a lot of different bird species. So one of the biggest questions that I get asked is, what makes a species invasive? Why is it invasive? What is that mechanism that separates just a non-native species from an invasive species? And truthfully, there are a lot of different things that can contribute to a species' ability to become invasive. So we're just going to touch on a few of those. The biggest one is environmental matching, or environmental matching, either through climate or habitat. Obviously, if we were to take a tropical freshwater fish and drop it in the Hudson River, it's probably not going to survive very well. It's at least not going to survive long enough to find a mate and reproduce and then be able to spread into potential new habitats. And that's because it just doesn't have the same climate, doesn't have the same habitat. That's why a lot of our invasive species are actually from the temperate regions of Europe and Asia. They have very similar climates to us, very similar habitats. So if they're introduced into our region, they're able to thrive. Other things like species-specific life history traits. This is going to include growth form and growth habit. If you think about on the terrestrial side, if you have a tree that's able to grow taller than other trees and able to shade out those other trees, that's going to be more successful. We think in the aquatic realm, we think about fish. A fish that is larger is going to have higher fecundity or higher reproductive output. That means they're going to be able to have more offspring. And those offspring are then going to be able to survive, reproduce, and spread. A lot of our invasive species also have generalist diets. That means that they eat pretty much anything, with some exceptions, which we'll discuss. And then environmental tolerance and plasticity. So this kind of goes against that environmental matching, because there are some species who are really adaptable. So they're able to come into new areas, especially if they come in, if we're talking about animals, if they come in as juveniles, they're actually able to adapt really quickly. And maybe that climate or habitat is not as important. It doesn't necessarily need to be exactly the same as their native habitat because they're able to adapt. Also, propagule pressure is a really big one. If we're talking about plants, the number of individual plants that are introduced is going to make a huge difference on whether or not that species is able to spread and become invasive. If we were just to take one plant or one fish and introduce it into a waterway, it's not going to have the best shot. But most of the time when we're dealing with invasive species, we're talking about numerous introductions, and all of that is going to help contribute to a higher propagule pressure and a higher likelihood of invasion. And then finally, areas of recent disturbance. If a species is introduced into an area that is either regularly disturbed, like the Hudson River, someplace that is a more hostile environment. The Hudson River is an estuary. The tides are going in and out constantly. So it's a pretty hostile environment habitat-wise, and it's constantly being disturbed. And so that's going to help contribute to a species' ability to establish. Now, we talk about aquatic invasive species. They are a little bit different than terrestrial species. And I just want you to take a look at these photos and consider one reason why, besides the obvious that they're found in water. So here we have a forested area. And if you're familiar with terrestrial invasive species, this is multiflora rose. And it's kind of taking over this whole area. And it's pretty obvious. It's obvious if you know the plant. You can see it's overgrowing a lot of the habitat here. And then on the other side of the coin, we have this sort of mountain ridge. There's not much happening here. So if something is introduced, we might notice it pretty quickly. And then we have this picture here. This is actually the Hudson River. And the Hudson River is home to over 150 aquatic invaders estimated, but you wouldn't really know that by looking at this picture. And that's because obviously aquatic species are a lot harder to detect, and they go a lot longer without being detected by anyone. So most of the time when we're noticing aquatic invasions, it's almost too late for them to be managed. And that's why I give presentations like this. When we look at the invasion curve here, you can see detection is right here is when prevention and eradication is the easiest and the cheapest. But as time goes on, it gets more expensive. The area infested gets a lot larger. And this is usually when most people start noticing the problem, especially in aquatic ecosystems. This is about the time when there are so many plants that are choking out the waterways. If you ever paddle on the Hudson and you paddle through these giant mats of water chestnut, which we will go over, you are probably aware of that problem at that point. And this is generally when eradication is a lot less likely. So let's talk a little bit about how these plants get introduced and how they spread. Invasive species can be introduced through a number of different mechanisms, and these are known as vectors. And for aquatic invasive species, the primary vectors for species introduction are usually going to depend on whether or not the species was introduced intentionally or by accident. So some intentional means aquaculture, either as food for human consumption or for use in commercial or recreational fisheries as bait or potential sport fish. We've also got the aquaria or ornamental trade. You can see this goldfish here, pretty common invasive species in our region due to aquarium dumping. And we also introduce them as biocontrol of other invasive species. This is the grass carp, and this is an invasive fish. It's not technically invasive in our region because we actually release sterile grass carp for management of aquatic invasive plants. In many cases, the invasive species we have aren't introduced intentionally to a natural system, but they're able to escape some sort of containment. So ballast water is one of the primary ways that we have invasive species introduced. This is a cargo ship. When these ships come into port, primarily in the Great Lakes, they actually hold all of this water in the boat to keep it afloat. And when they come into port, they have to release that water and able to dock. And that water gets released into the Great Lakes region. It's then able to travel over the Erie Canal, as you see here in this second photo, where it's then dropped right off into the Hudson River. So the Great Lakes and the Hudson River in the United States are the two highest populations of invasive species, I'll say. The Great Lakes, I think, has an estimated 350 or so. And then, as I mentioned, the Hudson River has about 150. And we also have natural disasters, things like tsunamis and hurricanes, which can introduce invasive species. And obviously, we don't have any control over that, at least in the moment that it happens. We also have a number of different ways that these species can spread once they are introduced. One way is, of course, through animal dispersal, but this is a lot less common than you might think. We can't just blame it all on the geese, even though we might want to. But things like water chestnut seeds and other fruits, a lot of these invasive species have hairy seeds or hairy fruits that are able to actually stick to bird feathers and other fur of aquatic mammals. The primary way that they're spread throughout our region is through hitchhiking on boats. This is one of the main reasons why we have our Clean, Drain, Dry campaign throughout this region, why we encourage people to always clean their boats, because this is one of the biggest ways that we can make a difference in reducing the spread of invasive species. We also have occurrences of aquarium dumping, people purchasing fish or even fish tanks that have plants in them that maybe they don't want anymore. And so they dump it. They think they're giving their fish a better life. There are two sides to that coin. One, you might be releasing a potential invasive species. And two, because whatever fish you might have isn't actually accustomed to this environment, it's actually not the best idea to release them, because you actually end up harming them in the process. And then, of course, natural dispersal methods, things like currents, wind. Once a species is introduced, especially if it's released into a river like the Hudson River system, then it's able to travel over currents and spread that way. Let's talk a little bit about impacts now. As I mentioned, an invasive species might not directly negatively impact the environment, the economy, or human health all at once. But in a lot of circumstances, all of these impacts are going to be connected through interference with the services that the environment provides for us. And these are known as ecosystem services. These include things like primary production, food and fresh water availability, water quality, and of course, recreation and aesthetic value. Very rarely will an invasive species impact some component of aquatic ecology without additional consequences to our everyday lives. So here are just a few examples of some impacts from aquatic invasive species. From an environmental standpoint, probably the most obvious is that they compete for both food or habitat. They predate on native species if we're talking about aquatic invasive animals. They can cause food web disruption, and they can also impair water quality. From an economics standpoint, they can decrease property values and aesthetics. They can cause damage to infrastructure. They can hinder the recreation or ecotourism industry. And they can also pull funds from other projects. If you have a huge invasive species infestation that you need to take care of before you get to whatever other project you might be needing to do, it's obviously going to add a substantial amount to the budget. This is a big problem when we think about projects to restore habitat for rare and endangered species. A lot of times it's not as simple as just correcting the damage from dams or, restoring other parts of the habitat. It's also having to take care of the invasive species that might be present. And then from a human health perspective, there have been occurrences of drowning from plant overgrowth, bioaccumulation of toxins. This is when multiple species or a species might consume one toxin and then it works its way up the food chain. This is a big problem with the zebra mussel. The spread of parasites, they can cause physical harm, like the zebra mussel, which is quite sharp, and also the water chestnut seeds, which are quite sharp. If you ever step on them, you won't forget it. And then the proliferation of harmful algal blooms. And this one is been a pretty hot topic over the past couple of years, especially in our region. Harmful algal blooms have been occurring much more frequently than they did in the past. And how invasive species can cause harmful algal blooms is because invasive species, specifically with plants, when they're able to outcompete native species and form these really dense populations, whenever those populations die back, some of them die back in the middle of the summer, like curly leaf pondweed. Whenever all of that biomass dies back and is released into the water, the bacteria that need to decompose that biomass actually consume a lot of oxygen. And whenever the oxygen is depleted, other things get released into the water, things like excess phosphorus, excess nitrogen. And that excess phosphorus actually triggers growth of algae. So it's all connected. And so when you have these mass diebacks of plants, you then get these really large algal blooms. And these might not always be toxic, but it's really difficult to tell without lab testing, which is why you'll see in this area a lot of beaches and public access lakes will put up signage if there's a harmful algal bloom, just because it's really difficult to know if they are toxic at that time. So now we're going to get into some identification. Unfortunately, it is very early in the season for gathering samples of these things. So we're just going to look at some photos today. But hopefully, if you're interested, sometime later in the season, we can do this again, or you can always come out with us, which I'll talk about a little bit more at the end. So first, the Chinese mystery snail. This was introduced through the aquarium trade. It's an excellent use for algae control in fish tanks because they love to eat and graze on algae. They can range a lot in color from light to dark brown to olive green. And they typically will have 7 to 8 whorls. Each one of these little rings here is considered a whorl, and they can have up to 8 of those. And they generally get to be about 2 inches long, but they can be much larger in lakes that are a little bit less used, where the recreation isn't as high. I have seen Chinese mystery snails up to 4 to 5 inches. So it really just depends on the specific site. One thing that distinguishes the Chinese mystery snail from most native snails is its operculum. And that's this item right here. This acts as a little trap door. And anytime the water becomes polluted, the Chinese mystery snail is actually able to shut that trap door. And this gives it a huge advantage because native snails do not have this operculum. So if you have a, really bad pollution event, say, something toxic gets, runs off into the waterway and causes a mass die-off of other species. The Chinese mystery snail will just shut that trapdoor, and it can last that way for a while, 2 weeks or more. But the native snails can't do that. They will die off. Once the water gets a little bit cleaner, the Chinese mystery snail just goes back to business. It starts reproducing right away to try and get its population numbers back up. And so it does that before the native snails are even able to try and get their population numbers back up. So because of that, it's able to, really drastically outcompete native snails in that way. You can also distinguish this snail from the position of its opening. The shell opening on Chinese mystery snail opens to the left rather than to the right. So native snails would generally be on this side here. This other species we have here, the Asian clam, it ranges anywhere from olive to yellowish or black, brown, a lot of different colors. As you can see here, they can be really light or even darker. And you can distinguish this from native clams by these really thick concentric growth rings, and they are actually raised, if you can see in this image, and you can feel it when you hold one of these in your hand. You can feel the distinction between each of those rings. And you can't do that with some native fingernail clams or pea clams, which you might confuse with the Asian clam. They're really small, generally less than 2 centimeters, and they have a pretty standard clam shape, this oval or triangular shape. One thing that's a little bit different is the central umbo, this part right here. Native clams are generally going to be more toward the side. They're going to be a little bit more curved, either toward the left or to the right. And the Asian clam prefers sandy sediment. So if you go to a lake or a pond that has really mucky, dark black sediment, that's not going to be as good of a habitat for the Asian clam. They generally like sand and sandy beaches, and they don't really even burrow that much. They're usually sitting right on top of the sand. All right, I said we would talk about the zebra mussel, so here it is. The zebra mussel was introduced into the Great Lakes through ballast water in the early 1990s. It is a bivalve mussel and a filter feeder, so that means that it actually filters plankton out of the water column. And it does this at an extremely fast rate when compared to other native bivalves. It is triangular or D-shaped, and it has these alternating white and brown stripes, which is what gives it its name. Kind of looks like a zebra a little bit. And these bands can vary a lot. They can be more wavy or straight, and it's very small. It can grow up to about 5 centimeters, but they're typically only about the size of your pinky nail or thumbnail. They like to attach to hard surfaces, as you can see on this shopping cart here, which is absolutely covered in zebra mussels. And they also like to attach to each other and native species. This is a bunch of zebra mussels on a native clam, which is obviously problematic for native species. The zebra mussel is one example of an aquatic invader who negatively impacts, many different components, because as a filter feeder, it depletes plankton from the water column and removes available food from smaller fish, which would in turn be normally feeding sport fish that are prized in recreational fisheries. And as it filters the water, it actually also can deposit high concentrations of toxins. And in the Hudson River, that's something like polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs, which have historically been a really big issue for this region. And those PCBs can then be found in the fish that we eat. So the zebra mussel is one of those invaders that really does cause an enormous amount of food web disruption. All right, next we're going to talk about the round goby. This species was introduced in the Great Lakes region very similarly to the zebra mussel through ballast water as larvae. The larval fishes of the round goby were released that way. It was released in 1990 through ballast water contained in oceanic shipping vessels, and it has since spread both through natural dispersal and assisted activity, primarily through its use as bait and improper disposal of bait buckets. Initially, this species was believed to have a really poor natural dispersal ability because it is a benthic fish. So generally, they can't move very quickly or very far. But it is able to actually disperse upstream against currents in rivers connected to the Great Lakes. So it's been able to spread throughout the Great Lakes and over the Erie Canal. And it's about halfway through the Erie Canal. We have not yet found it in the Hudson River. So it's really small, a really small benthic fish, only gets to about 17 centimeters. It has 2 dorsal fins and a prominent black spot on the first dorsal, which you can see here in this illustration. It also has a fused pelvic fin. So it looks almost like a little suction cup on its belly here. And its colors can vary quite a lot. You can see here in all, oh, they're all going away. Sorry. It can vary a lot in color, anywhere from really light gray to brown to black, depending on age and sex. This species feeds at night, which allows it to avoid predation. And it likes to eat eggs and larval smallmouth bass, as well as zebra mussels, which are a major part of their diet. So this is one of the more interesting cases in invasive species because the round goby should not have been successful here. The success of the round goby and its expansion is 100% attributed to the zebra mussel infestation. Because the zebra mussels were able to establish and kind of create this sort of ideal feeding ground for the round goby, when they were introduced, they actually, were able to thrive because the zebra mussel is their preferred diet in their native habitat. Both the zebra mussel and the round goby are from the Black and Caspian Seas. And so once the zebra mussel was able to establish and the round goby arrived, it just had an abundant food source. And that's why it's been able to establish and spread so far as it has. Next, we have the eastern mosquito fish. This is a species that's a bit newer, or like a bit newer to us in the prism, and has just recently come onto the scene and been kind of on my radar. This species is native to Florida and all the way from Florida up to Pennsylvania. So a lot of the eastern United States. It's really small, lightly colored, and it has these translucent fins with these really light spots that you can see here. And females actually have a dark eye spot and also a dark spot on its belly. This is where the live young are held. They are viviparous, so that means that they give birth to live young as opposed to laying eggs. This is really fascinating because there are not that many fish that do this. Males actually have this gonopodium. This is a secondary sex organ, which is used to help guide sperm for fertilization. And mosquito fish, as their name suggests, were widely introduced due to a claim that they would help diminish mosquito populations and reduce disease. But there has been no evidence to show that they actually reduce mosquito populations. So this is one case of biocontrol gone bad. This was obviously done back before we had the robust amount of regulations that we have now and the immense amount of research that needs to be done to release biocontrol now, luckily. This eastern mosquito fish can proliferate harmful algal blooms as well because of their really high consumption of zooplankton, which are then not around to kind of keep phytoplankton or algae in check. And they actually consume larval fishes as well as frog eggs. All right, next we have the spiny water flea. This was another species that was introduced into the Great Lakes in the 1980s from the Ponto-Caspian region, same as the zebra mussel and the round goby. It's a cladoceran zooplankton, so it only gets to about 15 millimeters. You see just on the tip of this guy's finger, just how small this is. It has a single tail, and it's about 2 times the size of its body, or 2 times the length of its body, with 1 to 3 spines. It really likes cooler water and lower nutrient lakes, which is not super common in our region. What happened? I'm sorry, 1 second. Nadia, can you hear me?
I can indeed. Oh, okay. There, it's back now.
Something cut out. Sorry.
You're all set now. It looks like it's back up.
Great. Sorry about that. So the spiny water flea prefers cooler water and lower nutrient lakes. And in our region, we have really high nutrient lakes. So it's not as likely to be a big threat to our region, but we do have some areas in Minnewaska State Park and other lakes that are more oligotrophic or lower nutrient. So it is still a risk. It also really likes brackish water like we have in the Hudson River. It consumes other zooplankton, which means that it competes with small fish. And one of its biggest impacts that we can easily see is that it fouls fishing lines. So if you leave a fishing line out in a spiny water flea infestation, you'll end up with something that looks like this really large gelatinous mass. Currently, we have spiny water flea in the Finger Lakes region and the Adirondacks. So it's very possible that we might have it already and we just haven't found it yet. Okay, so I just want to go over a couple of plants as well. So Eurasian water milfoil. This is one of our most common invasive plants here in the region. It was introduced through the aquarium trade. It has a really thin stem, which can vary quite a lot in color, from light green to dark green, pink even in some cases, you can see here. And it can get up to 10 feet long. It has these 4 feather-like leaves arranged in a whorl, and we say they're feather-like because you can see here they look like a feather that's had its tip cut off here. And it has 14 or more leaflets. So each one of these is a leaflet, each one of these little barbs coming off this feather. It can also have a floral spike. So this is a spike that sticks up on top of the water that has a small 4-part flower, and that can range from white to pink. But we don't see a lot of the floral spikes here in this region. I've only seen them in a few lakes. Eurasian water milfoil can thrive in pretty much any environment. It's got a wide tolerance for salinity, temperature, and pH, and it does really well in disturbed areas that have high nutrient loading. So that's a lot of lakes in our region. It's also interesting because the plant dies off in the fall, but the roots are actually able to survive through the winter, and new stems will actually start growing in the early spring once the water reaches about 60 degrees. So this makes the plant one of the earliest appearing in the season, which is obviously allows it to assist or to grow into dense colonies and crowd out native species. It also reproduces primarily through fragmentation. So that means if you pull off even a single one of these whorls, as long as it has the stem and the node attached, it can actually form a whole new plant just from one of these whorls. So if you're ever paddling through an area with Eurasian water milfoil and you break up some of it, be sure to try and not leave it in the water, because you'll actually end up allowing for more plants to grow just because you broke off a couple of pieces of the plant. All right, up next we have water chestnut. This species was primarily introduced through the ornamental pond trade. Sorry, I don't know what happened. Through the ornamental pond trade. And if you've ever spent any time on the Hudson, you probably recognize this plant. It's pretty common in our region, but we still don't have it in a lot of our inland water bodies. So it has a buoyant cord-like stem, which can get up to 16 feet long, but it does like shallower areas more toward the edge of the water. It also has these feathery submersed leaves on the stem, in addition to all of these serrated leaves that are arranged in a rosette. And this is the part of the plant that actually sits right on top of the water, as you can see here in this image. It has air petioles that's right here on attaching to each one of these leaves. They're actually filled with air, which allows it to float. And it has these four-horned, sharp, barbed nutlets. These are the bane of everyone's existence who likes to recreate on the Hudson. If you step on one of these, it can go through the bottom of your shoe. It also has, especially when it's still attached to the plant, it has these barbs that go in the opposite direction. So if you actually puncture your finger or your foot, it's kind of difficult to pull out the nutlet without getting some of those barbs stuck in your skin. The green seed you see on the bottom of this plant here, these are actually live, so they will drop off and form new plants. But once you find them in this stage, the black seeds, this means that they have already been spent. They're no longer attached to a plant. These are not as big of a threat as the seeds that are still green here. Water chestnut can tolerate freshwater and estuarine environments, so that's water with a little bit of salinity. But it does best in more slow-moving lakes, ponds, rivers that are less than 15 feet deep. It really likes high nutrient levels with muddy substrates, and it can grow into these really dense mats, even stacking on top of each other. So this infestation here in this image is actually only 1 or 2 years old. So that just goes to show you how quickly this plant can reproduce. And that's because the primary form of reproduction is through this seed production. And each seed can grow into 10 or 12 stems, and each one of those stems can host up to 20 rosettes. And in turn, each rosette can then produce 20 seeds. And those seeds drop off typically in mid-August. Those seeds are able to start germinating during the next growth cycle, or they can lay dormant for up to 12 years in the sediment. So you can see just how quickly you'll get a population this size just from a few plants because of that seed production. Those seeds can be dispersed by currents, waterfowl, or entire rosettes can, typically be seen attached to boat motors and trailers. All right, the next plant I have here is Hydrailla. This is one of our newest invaders. We still don't have it in a lot of places. Right now we have the Croton River Hydrailla infestation pretty close to Teatown. And then we also have one more population in Orange County. But for the most part, this is still very much an emerging species in our region. And it was introduced through the aquarium trade. You can see here in these images just how robust it is and how hardy it is. So it makes a great aquarium plant. Stems can actually grow up to 30 feet, which is quite long. They can grow up to several inches per day. The leaves are lance-shaped, and they're actually serrated. If you can see here in this image, you can see these serrations with the naked eye, which is what's going to set it apart from some native species that look like it. Native Alodia is a really common native plant that gets commonly confused with Hydrailla. but you can definitely see the serrations in this plant. It has whorls of 3 to 5. Typically, we'll see them in whorls of 5. And it likes freshwater and brackish water, or water with some salinity. It likes lakes, ponds, rivers. It's tolerant of a lot of different conditions, a wide range of nutrient levels and salinities, light conditions, temperature. And what makes Hydrailla particularly threatening is that it has 3 different reproductive mechanisms. So Hydrailla can actually reproduce through fragmentation, similarly to Eurasian water milfoil that I mentioned. So if we break off just a piece of this plant, we can actually grow another plant directly from that. It also reproduces turions, which are overwintering buds that actually drop off of the plant. And then it reproduces through tubers, which are these little potato-like structures you see here in this image. And these can actually lay dormant and stay viable in the sediment for quite some time. So one of the biggest challenges with treating Hydrailla, and one of the biggest challenges that's been treating Hydrailla in the Croton River, is that tuber production. Because if you don't treat for the tubers and you're only treating for the top portion of the plant, you're not going to make much of an impact because these tubers are going to keep, reproducing more and more plants. All right, so we talked a lot about some of the major problems, but I also want to give you some action items that you can do. The biggest thing, and what we tell everyone, especially if you recreate in the region at all, is to clean, drain, and dry. That doesn't just apply to boats. That can apply to any gear you might use in the water. So if you like to go snorkeling, if you like to go fishing, obviously if you like to go boating, it's really important that you always clean, drain, dry. And what do we mean by that? Clean, if you don't have access to a high pressure hot water system, which most people don't, we recommend at least using a 2 to 10% bleach solution on any items that you might be carrying between water bodies. And then it's also really important to drain out any water, any standing water, especially from boats, to drain out the water from your bilge and other standing compartments. And then we also recommend drying. And the recommendation for that is typically 5 days in the sun, which can be a long time, especially during the summer. You're not wanting to wait 5 days necessarily between, going out and spending some time on the water. But, it's always good to do something, even if you can't, do it perfectly. So even if it's only a couple of days, it's better than nothing. The biggest part of this is to clean. You want to make sure that you're removing any mud or debris, anything that might harbor larval organisms, and especially plant fragments. Also, if you fish, it's really good to always report your catch, whether it's native or invasive. It's obviously going to help either way. And if you know that you have an invasive species, do not ever release it. That includes fish, it includes plants. Once you capture an invasive species, it's then your responsibility not to release it back into the waterways where it's able to continue reproducing and spreading. And this includes potential invaders, which might be used as bait. A lot of really small fish, once people are done with them, they will release them. It's really important to not do that because that's how we get a lot of our invasive species. So some ways of reporting. One of the best ways, and one of the greatest gifts of technology, has been the creation of a lot of different mobile apps, things like Seek, iNaturalist, and IMAP Invasives. We actually have projects on iNaturalist and IMAP Invasives that you can join and be a part of, so that all of your reports will filter in to be seen by me. And then I'll be able to confirm those, and maybe we can actually do something about them if we're finding them in new areas. So speaking of iNaturalist, I want to share this video. If any of you are not familiar with the app, this is a really quick tutorial on using it, and it just gives an overview on how exactly iNaturalist works. It might not work. That's okay. I'd rather not wait for it to load.
It might be a little laggy through
So-
the Wi-Fi through Zoom.
Yeah, it's okay. I can obviously share the link to iNaturalist if anyone's not familiar with it. We also have a lot of different tutorials on the Lower Hudson Prism website for using iNaturalist and IMAP invasives. Some major tips that I like to give for reporting aquatic invasive species specifically. When you're taking pictures, it's really important to get them in their natural form. So make sure you're taking them in the water and try and get full shots of the plant. So this is a shot of Eurasian water milfoil. And if someone were to send this to me, I would really quickly know what it is. And same for iNaturalist. If you're going to upload a picture to iNaturalist, you want to make sure that you're getting it in its natural form. If you pull a plant out of the water and maybe you're holding it in your hand, it's a lot trickier for those algorithms to recognize it as an aquatic plant. So you're less likely to get a positive ID when doing something like that. It's also really good to include a lot of different photos, different angles. Make sure you're pointing out identifying features, things like flowers, fins, if you're talking about fish, leaves, fruits, and seeds. So here on the bottom here, this is that whirl from Eurasian water milfoil. And if someone were to send this to me, I would very easily recognize it as Eurasian water milfoil. All right, so now I'm just gonna open it up to questions. And I'm not sure how we want to do that, Nadia, if anyone has.
Well, there's only a handful of us here, so I think if anyone wants to either unmute themselves or if you're more comfortable with the chat, by all means, I'll make sure that I have that open as well. Thank you so much, Lindsay. That was wonderful. And just briefly before we start with any questions, I want to let everyone know that I will be sending this recording over the next few days, and I'll send along that iNaturalist video. And Lindsay, if you're comfortable, I can share your presentation as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Because I know the photos in there were really valuable. I wanted to note as well, the Chinese mystery snail information was really interesting to me, and specifically that water flea photo on the fishing line as well. So if anyone has any questions, by all means.
Yeah, and there's a lot of other, while we're waiting for people to ask questions, if anyone has them, we have a lot of other resources too, field guides that have been created on behalf of the Prism for aquatic species that people can take out and easily, print on their own. And so many different tutorials.
I really would encourage anyone with any sort of questions, really do email Lindsay or email anyone else at Teatown or Prism. That's why we're around, to be a resource for everyone. And if we don't know the answer to something, whether it's about aquatic invasives or anything else, we can find somebody who will be able to answer. So make sure you use us. If nobody has any questions yet, Lindsay, I would just ask, could you tell us a little bit more about what you do with Prism when you're out in the field, or what you do for Teatown when
Yeah, definitely. So typically from early May, so right about now, through October, I manage a seasonal crew. We have 4 members this year, and they're all AmeriCorps members. And we travel around the Lower Hudson region, and we do lake monitoring throughout the area. So this year, we have 42 sites that we're going to be monitoring for aquatic invasive species. And we also manage water chestnut at multiple sites. I think this year we have 12 sites that we're managing water chestnut at. It's a pretty hectic time. We're out pretty much every day at a new location looking for aquatic invasive species. We primarily focus on plants and small invertebrates, but we hope to be getting into some fish sampling this season as well.
Here's a great question. Does Teatown Lake have any problems with invasives?
Yes, Teatown has not that many invasives actually. Well, we have 4 species, but the actual infestations are not that large. We have Eurasian water milfoil, curly leaf pondweed, water chestnut, and Marsilia quadrifolia, which is European water fern. It's one of the only populations of that invasive plant in the region. I think there's only 2. So it's us and one other spot. But Teatown has a lot of native coontail, which actually I think is keeping the invasive species sort of at bay. But we have been treating the invasive species for the past couple of years, and hoping to dial those back a bit and keep those from spreading any further.
I have one more question, but I want to give everyone a moment if anybody else wants to unmute themselves or type anything. All right, well, my question that I have is, in addition to what you're looking for when you have a lake or a pond, is there anything that anyone should be looking for if they have a small creek or a stream in their backyard or on their property?
Yeah, a lot of these species can survive in rivers, especially plants like Eurasian water milfoil, curly leaf pondweed, which we did not go over today. But you can see it in the field guide, which I can share with you, Nadia, if you want to send it out to all of the participants. And Asian clam, rusty crayfish is one you can see pretty readily in rivers. And there's probably quite a bit more, but rivers are a little less common for invasive just because of the currents. And so it's a lot harder for things to establish depending on the speed.
All right. Well, if there are no other questions, we're right on time, heading up to 8 now. So I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. And again, if you have any questions that come to you after this, email Lindsay or anyone else, and we'll make sure that she reaches those questions. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks. Bye.